Hello folks, welcome back to our recorded lectures for ML103. This is To Valhalla, the depiction of the Norse afterlife. So our key questions for today: how is Valhalla actually characterized in Norse literature? And of course, how is it adapted for use by our video games? What is the attraction of using this particular element of medieval Scandinavian culture? So it's actually fairly tricky to find evidence for the belief in Valhalla in our sources from the period. Valhalla is such a key part of our popular conception of the Vikings that you'd think there'd be lots more about it, but it apparently was not as significant as Norse literature as we might have thought. It does have a presence, but it wasn't part of what appears to have been the core sort of corpus of pre-Christian belief. There are various reasons that this might have happened. Now, in Old Norse, the name is actually Valhall, which translates to Hall of the Slain. Valhalla is a sort of Anglicization or modernization of the original name. It is Odin's Hall. You might call it the Odinic version of paradise. It is linked to his cult, and it is shaped particularly to appeal to those who held Odinic beliefs. So it served as an option for a high-status heroic afterlife for aristocratic warriors. Now, for a long time, people have tried to look for Valhalla in the archaeological level. There's been a tendency, for example, to interpret any female figures found on an object in a grave as a Valkyrie. But most of those depictions are found in women's graves, and women, from everything we're told in literature, did not go to Valhalla. So why would they have representations of Valkyries in their grave if that was the case? So this, by the way, foreshadows the whole problem with the question of female warriors amongst the medieval Scandinavians. I mean, how you interpret grave goods in a female burial that appears to reflect a warrior's identity, that's a tough question. It's not as clear-cut as you might think. So, for example, just because a woman's buried with weapons doesn't mean that she spent her life using them. It also doesn't mean that she didn't. There could be many possibilities. Now, I will say that personally speaking, I find it pretty persuasive to say that yes, the Odin cult excluded women, but that didn't mean there weren't female warriors who worshipped other gods. Now, when it comes right down to it, though, there is no specific evidence of a belief in Valhalla reflected in the remnants of pagan material culture that we do have. It is possible that the myth of Valhalla only really started to take shape in the later Viking Age. It would have done that sort of as a combination of trends in poetry and an emphasis on the aristocratic warrior class. So, for example, we see skaldic praise poems that actually date from what we believe is the first half of the 10th century. And the three that I would mention, first of all, are Hrafsmal, Eriksmal, and Hakar Narmal. These are basically Odinic poems shaped to appeal to the tastes of the warrior aristocracy. All of them mention Valhalla. More significant, perhaps, is the discussion of Valhalla in Grunnesmal. Odin is the narrator, and he describes the various halls that are home of the gods, including Valhalla. He says that it's in Gladsheimer, which is one of the regions of Asgard. He calls it gold bright, and says the hall has spear shafts for rafters, with shields it is thatched, mailcoats are strewn on the benches. There is a wolf in front of the western doors hanging, and an eagle flying above the western doors. Now, Sabrimnar is a magical pig. He is called the best of pork. He is boiled every day. The poem is a little sketchy about how this was the way in which the einherjar are nourished. Didn't really explain what that meant, and I will tell you what the einherjar were shortly. Now, what about Snorri? Okay, Snorri's depiction of Valhalla, of course, is far more detailed and flowery than anything we see in the older poems. This is only to be expected. We have to keep in mind he's writing about practices that have long since died out by his lifetime. He is a Christian. He's not someone who followed the pre-Christian traditions, but he is the architect of the eventual literary tradition. He is drawing on existing depictions of Valhalla. He bases his description very firmly on Grimnishmal. So he characterizes Valhalla as a feast hall built by Odin in Asgard. It has a roof of golden shields and 540 doors. Again, this is a detail drawn specifically from the older poems. What he gets into in more detail is what goes on in Valhalla. It has the sort of ambiance you'd expect of a feasting hall, complete with entertainers. He specifically mentions jugglers tossing multiple knives. The courtiers are seen as playing chess with golden chessmen, but also fighting each other, and fighting each other very fiercely without being killed. This would have emphasized the otherworldly nature of this feast hall. Now, it's fair to say there was brawling at times at feasts in the real world of medieval Scandinavia. We have numerous documents that attest to that. And sometimes this is even brawling with edged weapons. But for there to be no consequences to the brawlers in terms of wounds or accidental deaths is obviously a sign that we're not dealing with the real world, per se, but with the realm of the gods. Now, while the inhabitants of Valhalla weren't polishing their fighting skills, they ate the magical boar, Saramnar. Snorri is more specific about how the boar came back to life each night and was butchered again in the morning. It's a bit of a depressing life to lead, if you think about it. But this is how those who dwelled in Valhalla were fed. There was also a magical goat, Hydrun, that gave great quantities of mead instead of milk. And this is accomplished by the goat eating the leaves of a magical tree. Now, something else that happened at Valhalla was that the Valkyries served at the table. It's interesting that they were characterized as serving women, but they were also those who chose to bring each warrior there, of course. So they had more control than you might think, especially since women who served the mead or the ale at a king's table tended to be high-status women. So that's worth bearing in mind. Life in Valhalla is depicted as highly desirable in a lot of ways. You hone your identity as a warrior. You're served at table by beautiful and powerful women. You have all the mead and meat you want, and you are living in a beautiful setting. Now, this doesn't come without a cost, of course. You're there for a reason. So I promised I would explain who the einherjar are. These are the warriors who dwell in Valhalla. They enjoy its benefits in return for specific services in days to come. The word einherjar translates roughly as lone fighters. These are the heroic dead, those chosen by the Valkyries, or in some texts by Odin himself, to dwell in Valhalla and to await the time of Ragnarok. Now, in essence, Valhalla is a divine training camp. It anticipates the need to deal with the end of the world. So we are told that on the day of reckoning, 800 of the einherjar will exit each door of Valhalla and help fight to protect the home of the gods. Now, I'm going to give you a little bit of a poem that really describes their role quite nicely. All the einherjar in Odin's fields hack each other each day. They choose slaughter and ride from the field. Later sit reconciled together. So they are constantly attacking each other, cutting each other up with swords in Valhalla, but they're all fine the next morning. And they're rewarded for honing their skills by feasting in Valhalla, by feasting with Odin and enjoying the luxuries that they're given. Some scholars speculate this is a leftover of a sort of Odin cult, where warriors entered into a new sort of cosmic relationship with the god. The fact that Odin worshippers had this sort of relationship with their deity is not just speculation. I mean, we also have the example of the berserkers, who were worshippers of Odin who fought in a sort of bear-like trance fury. There are other Northern European cultures where we see various forms of berserkers, but in Old Norse texts, they're often associated specifically with Odin and with bears. There are also some that are associated with wolves, to be fair. Now, in one text, Loki actually addresses Thor with the singular version of the word. He calls him einherjar. This is the only time we see the singular version of the word in Norse literature. So are the einherjar connected to Thor? Are they perceived as being in a sort of familial relationship with Odin, since Thor was Odin's son? It's hard to say. I mean, what I wanted to emphasize first and foremost here is that Valhalla is not paradise. It is actually not an eternal resting place. It's a place that warriors get to enjoy until the end of the world, at which point they have a job to do. So, how do we see Valhalla reflected in our case study games? Now, as we'll discuss in next week's lectures, or rather, that would be the week after reading week's lectures, we do see Skyrim making use of the Ragnarok story as inspiration for its central plot arc surrounding Alduin, but it's obviously done in a very loose way. This is not an adaptation of Norse myth, but instead a sort of free-form borrowing of archetypes and imagery, and sort of smushing it all together and reimagining it in a fantasy context. So the Nords of Skyrim do believe in a place very much like Valhalla. They call it Sovngarde. It's the Hall of Shor, who is a warrior god in the human pantheon. That is simplifying things to a significant degree. The cosmology of the Elder Scrolls is rather complicated. It's similar to Valhalla in that you need to have died in battle to access it. There is mead drinking, gaming, the opportunity to hone your skills as a warrior. Now, Sovngarde has a bridge guarded by a mighty warrior who tests the newly arrived dead to see if they're worthy to cross and feast with the heroes of old. This is not quite true to Norse mythology, but it makes it more interesting from a gameplay standpoint. In Skyrim, of course, the guardian of the bridge is Tsun, not Heimdall, and the bridge is made of whalebone, so this is not like the Bifrost of Norse mythology, which you might know is called the Rainbow Bridge. Sovngarde is a setting for actual gameplay in Skyrim. It's where the battle with Alduin finally happens. The Dragonborn has to find their way into Sovngarde, where they discover that Alduin had created a mist that allowed him to hide and eat the souls of the dead in order to increase his strength. Now, by challenging Tsun to a duel, the Dragonborn gains access to the hall and contacts 3 dead heroes there. And these are 3 ancient Nordic heroes who were involved in temporarily stopping Alduin back in ancient times. They were able to banish him from time until the 4th era, where he would reemerge and it would be the Dragonborn's duty to stop him. Now, what's interesting is that a Dragonborn who has completed the Civil War plotline by the time they travel to Sovngarde will also see the leaders of whatever faction lost there in the mists. So whether it's Ulfric and Gelmar or Legate Riki, it sort of hammers home that both sides were Nords. And if they died in combat fighting for what they believed in, whether that was a good cause or not, and of course with the Civil War, both sides have their problems. It really does, sort of pay homage to the concept of the warrior culture. So basically, there is enough here to be recognizable as a Valhalla parallel. It's not an accurate reflection of the Norse Valhalla, but it shares certain characteristics and basic physical elements, for lack of a better description. But it is a loose adaptation, and this is quintessentially neo-medieval. It can feel semi-authentic without really being Valhalla. Now, Valhalla as simulation in Assassin's Creed Valhalla. The Valhalla of Assassin's Creed is very different than Sovngarde because at the same time it is a much more literal adaptation and it is a science fiction version because it is a simulation. It's something that's run by the Yggdrasil world tree. Now, I find it interesting that in the Vision Quest arc, when you spend time in Asgard, thanks to the Seer's potions, you don't visit Valhalla at any point. You run around to other parts of Asgard and eventually Jotunheim, many of which have direct connections to mythology, but Valhalla itself is saved for the resolution of ACV's Isu plot arc. So the Valhalla, as I said, that Ivor encounters with his brother Sigurd, or their brother Sigurd, is a simulation. It's created by the supercomputer in the Yggdrasil vault. So the supercomputer was meant to contain the essences of the reincarnated Isu. And it seems to have recreated the Valhalla simulation as a way of providing something that the Norse era reincarnated Isu, so Sigurd, Svala, and Ivor, would recognize as something familiar to them. It's a way of keeping them content, presumably, until they could be reincarnated again. Within the simulation itself, it's a very literal version of Valhalla. You see the hall, the feasting, the horns sound, and you rush out the doors to fight in the meadows outside. It's both really beautiful and really gory at the same time. Like everything is flooded with golden light, it is idyllic, but when you hit people in the fighting, they basically fly apart into pieces. But everybody is restored the next day. But what's interesting is that the futility of it is something that Assassin's Creed Valhalla does emphasize. Sigurd, for instance, keeps losing the arm that he lost in real life during his captivity and torture by the Order of the Ancients. At first he's blasé about it because, hey, it'll grow back. But then he starts to get frustrated, and Ivor uses that as a way to convince him that this is not real, that it's repetitive, that it's meant to trap them. Now, Svala, on the other hand, it's a completely different case. This is the mother of the Cirrus that helps Ivor. She is perfectly content to be there. She's actually the reincarnation of Freya, and she's aging and dying. So this is much preferable to, being in her body. But Ivor sees through it almost at once. They don't see it as satisfying, just as a show. Something that has the outward trappings of the perfect Viking lifestyle, but which is fundamentally empty without substance. And one of the ways in which Ivor sees this is that they keep imagining that they see their father. And as anybody who's played the game knows, Ivor's father dies long, long ago. He's killed by Kjotve the Cruel. And he is killed when he tries to surrender to save his clan. So it is a death that's without honor, according to the warrior code. So there's no way he would be in Valhalla. But Sigurd manages to sort of conjure up an image of Varen, Ivor's father. And Ivor's like, this is not right. My father cannot be in Valhalla. This isn't real. So Ivor and Sigurd proceed to escape the simulation and to fight their nemesis, Bazim, the one they didn't realize was a nemesis in the real world. Now, this is actually quite thought-provoking writing, if you consider it carefully. There is sort of an implicit judgment here about whether or not Valhalla would be satisfying to the average Scandinavian warrior. I mean, maybe with the possibility of helping defend the home of the gods against Ragnarok, which is not something that's covered in Assassin's Creed's version of Valhalla. But Valhalla itself is a waiting room, and Ivor's not content with that. Now, we can't really talk about Valhalla in God of War because we haven't seen it yet. We know that it exists, that the Valkyries chose people and brought them to it, and this is where Odin messed around with them and stopped them from doing their jobs, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in the next lecture too. But looking at Skyrim and Assassin's Creed Valhalla, we can see a couple of different medievalist takes on it. Sovngarde is a pure neo-medieval adaptation, very loose, but with sufficient recognizable elements for anyone who knows a little about Valhalla to see the obvious parallels. Now, while Assassin's Creed actually deconstructs the idea of Valhalla by portraying it in a very literal fashion, yet one that also fits within the Isu plot and the established technological capabilities of the precursor civilization. This Valhalla is actually part of Ivor's wider character arc, I would argue. Now, Ivor still claims that they want the glorious reputation as a warrior towards the end of the game, but they're starting to see, as we'll discuss on other occasions, just how damaging and counterproductive some of the Scandinavian methods for achieving that ideal have been. Now, in a way, Ivor's rejection of the Valhalla simulation is much more in line with the Scandinavian mindset as we see it in something like the Havamal. So what happens after death is not important in comparison to what you do during life. Everything dies except the story that you've made of your life, the reputation that you've earned. which is a sentiment that Ivor expresses on more than one occasion, and which really, if you take a step back and think about it, emphasizes the diversity in the Scandinavian worldview. Okay, thanks very much, guys. We'll be back with the Drogair. Thanks again.